So what exactly are we up to in this class? By week 5, that is a question that should arise, correct? Are we learning lists of the elements and constituents of drama or narrative or fiction or the short story or the novel or the poem or some subset of a genre, or not a subset of a genre, the genre boldly at large? We're headed soon to find out something about poetry, of course. No. I mean, you can tell that I have not been distributing, I think you would have noticed, if I'd been distributing lists of generic criteria. We have been interested in generic criteria. We've been interested in specific generic criteria, the drama, the chorus, for example, of the tragedy, right? But we have not been exhaustive. We have not felt that, or I have not felt, and maybe you've noticed this, I have not felt that it is our ambition in this class for you to learn all about the various elements of genre, any particular genre, drama, tragedy. A course in tragedy would be the course in which you would learn all the various elements of tragedy. We're learning, this will be maybe no surprise to some of you who are seniors, I think we have a few of you in the class. We're learning what you already know, right? A lot of it. That there are such genres, there are such elements of such genres. We're also learning something that I think you sort of know, easy to forget, in part because you've internalized it to a certain degree, or you will internalize it, right? And it's something that has to be known, I think, has to be grasped at a certain level, as I'm calling it here, in the more sophisticated and firmer collegiate college level manner required of majors and minors. And what is that? It's that it pays to know about these elements of genre, right? These characteristics of the various genres, these dynamics of the subgenres, these mechanics of the various literary forms. Boy, does it pay. Boy, does it pay when you approach the reading of an individual work of art with some awareness, okay, of the tradition. We're going to get to that down the road here in this class. At this point, we're just looking at the genres themselves, not so much the tradition of what's been said, but the kinds of things that have been said, that have been written, right, and established. Boy, does it help to know a little bit about those dynamics, okay, those mechanics, the elements, of course, that in fact dynamically, okay, are present to us as we read a play like Trifles, right? I'm not going to go back to Trifles. Rather go to the plot-story distinction for a good example at this point, though there are numerous such good examples. What we've been doing up to this point in the course is accumulating good examples of these various elements of mostly drama up to this point. Now we're with fiction and narrative, right? These various elements that knowledge of which tremendously enhances the reading experience, okay? And the experience of understanding literature and the experience of appreciating literature at its, at a higher level, at a level that is to be expected of educated people who've been to college, okay? And especially when they're English majors and minors, although I think that the kind of thing we're doing in a class like this is, has a more general kind of application, perhaps, but we won't get into that right now. The plot-story distinction offers a good example. To be aware that such exists, simply that very sophisticated readers, okay, although the distinction doesn't depend upon your being sophisticated. I think even if you're not very sophisticated, at some level it's working on you, okay? You're just not aware enough of it for it to really be of much aid to you. This distinction, okay, that has been of such importance to, let's call them more experienced readers, okay, of narrative, to be mindful of it as we read is to put ourselves in a position to see certain things that we're otherwise not going to see, okay? And just, again, this is just one example. This is the plot-story opposition. When you're aware of it, are you not more aware than you otherwise would be of the question of causality? So the plot-story distinction really matters. Well, it does. Mod3 Q3 asked you to define plot using readings for the week, and then write a plot summary as opposed to a story summary of Chopin's The Story of an Hour. Noah and Maggie alone took up the definitional challenge and both assert that, quote, the summary gives an idea of the plot in the story without entirely giving away the ending of the story, providing, quote, a little bit of a sneak peek into the story, one that will help interest readers enough to want to find out more and to see how the story will end. That's Noah. As Maggie concurs, a, quote, plot summary does not give away any major story details, which is what differentiates the plot and summary. But do not summaries, right? Plot summaries, story summaries indeed contain spoilers covering the entire reach of events in a story. Moreover, the question asks you to distinguish not story plot from summary, but story summary from plot summary. So as a student in a different section does in describing the latter, does so essentially as a series of narrative events expanded on by the causes and motivations of each event as to how it connects and furthers the story. Getting into causation then. This is what you do when you're writing a plot summary as opposed to a story summary. Consulting and combining descriptions available in the Norton, as well as the glossary, as does yet another unnamed student, we could quote and summarize as follows. The king died, then the queen died. That's a story. The king died, and then the queen died of grief. That's a plot. The latter stirs speculation about why things happen, takes a position on those questions of causation, why the queen dies, not just that the queen dies. Quote, the plot goes deeper than the events of the story, dives into motivation and reasons for actions. The plot summary, accordingly, provides a comprehensive overview of the why. A story summary, by contrast, would just tell you the event, being but, quote, a bare synopsis of the temporal order of what happens. Clear enough? The satisfying plot summaries in this other class followed on the heels of satisfying definitional gambits. Reading through them, I noted that most centered on the ending, which obviously poses that central plot question of why. Why does Mrs. Mallard die? You know what story we're talking about. K mentions that early bit of foreshadowing of what is to come by pointing out Mrs. Mallard's heart troubles. Here we have the how, she dies of a heart attack. The why she has a heart attack remains an issue. K's answer, quote, Mrs. Mallard dies from heartbreak, an accumulation from years of continuous heartache, once she realizes that her brief taste of freedom is over. She dies due to the shock at finding that her husband has not died after all. He walks in on her at the end of the story, and that's what kills her. K adroitly bases this judgment on Mrs. M's unexpected reaction to the news, the original news of her husband's death, which turns out to be false. Meditating while looking out the window, she experiences a sensation of liberation. Quote, as she's gazing out of the window, she mentions trees that a quiver with new spring life and is completely overcome with emotion as she tells herself that she is finally free. And student Q agrees. Quote, she begins to embrace this new reality, this new beginning, and her heart beats hard in excitement at that prospect. Note how X, yet another student in this other section, explores the theme of the story, the end product, perhaps, of any good plot summary. Chopin's tale raises questions in her time period about the limitations imposed by marriage and the inherent desire for individual freedom through the use of life and death. Quote, women in this time period had no real life to live when trapped in the constraints of their marriage. More on plot coming next. Regarding Foster's simplicity, it is helpful simplicity, but a simplicity nonetheless. Right? I'm going back to this business about story versus plot in Forster. You will recall you have a plot summary when you have the king died, then the queen died of grief, as opposed to just the king died, then the queen died. Well, is story not at all, if you have a story summary, is it really simply not interested whatsoever in motivation, in the why of an event? Isn't it more of a matter of emphasis? Story is more interested in what than why? It is wrong to say that story summaries don't make any mention of motivation, because many of them do. Quote, she found out her husband was still alive and was so happy that she died on the spot. Note how the why is mentioned in passing. It's not omitted entirely, it's just not emphasized. And you can't imagine going from that quick story summary that I just read, which does get into, in passing, the question of the why, very briefly, right? But doesn't do so in such a way as to prompt a statement of theme, right? I think you'll get a really keen sense of what I'm talking about if you see what I'm saying right now. Whereas a plot summary would be foregrounding that why to the point that the next step would be an easy formulation of theme. Note how a student in a previous semester of this course portrays awareness of this refinement of the Forster principle. Quote, looking at the ending line, when the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease, of the joy that kills. Without the context of the rest of the story, reader would think that Mrs. Mallard learned her husband died and was so overjoyed to discover him alive that she passed away. The plot, however, disagrees. Thought that was so well said. The plot, however, disagrees. It begs to differ. That's put so well. Plot and story often disagree in the sense that they do not coincide. Here in Chopin, we have disagreement to the degree that they quarrel. The story is so busy telling us what. Says that she died of joy. Joy of the sort of the intensity that can kill. We walk away thinking, I learned something about joy, just how intense it can get. You see how we're now getting into theme? I'm so excited to see what happens that I might miss a detail. That motive, joy ascribed to Mrs. M, it's ascribed not by the narrator, but by the doctors. Right? That's a little detail that it's easy to miss. Now, the plot, I walk away thinking, really thinking, joy schmoy. It's disappointment that does the killing here. And I now decide that to explain what has happened here, we really do need to move past intensity, the question of quantity, to sort. It's the sort of disappointment that is issue here. That is at issue here. Disappointment of one's hopes for the future, of one's anticipation of freedom. Reconfinement subsequent to a taste of freedom, of the promise of freedom can kill. So necessary to human existence is freedom. What a story told us, mere contemplation of what happened, told us was a short fiction about the power of human joy. Plot tells us is truly a short fiction about our need to be free. And you can see how someone who stuck to story and was not interested in plot might just miss the deeper implications of this literary phenomenon called the story of an hour. Enough of this? Not so fast. A couple of slightly different but not discordant themes. These are not themes that are in conflict with the theme that we just discovered by means of a plot-wise reading. They are slightly different themes that seem to accord with this theme that we just discovered. These themes also emerge from a plot-wise consideration of Chopin's Story of an Hour. Note how Joseph identifies a slightly different, if not discordant, theme by noting what the supposedly grieving Mrs. Mallard sees as she looks out of the window. As John A. notes, such details are crucial clues and hints. He's quoting Forster. Here's Joseph, quote, and he's quoting in the first sentence here, he's quoting the Norton, he's quoting Chopin. She could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees that were all aquiver with the new spring life. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. This is what she sees when she looks out of the window, okay, by herself. There's more written, Joseph continues, and described about the springtime, in addition to what was just quoted, a time where a sense of freshness and beginnings are usually viewed. This relates to the plot, continues Joseph, because it is the sense of freshness, because it is the undertones of what is really being mentioned. Mrs. Mallard feels free for the first time, and she's seeming to enjoy it, unquote. To what Joseph here says, I would add only that Mrs. Mallard is coming to self-knowledge, and she's doing so by observing her own authentic, unmediated vision of the world. She's seeing how she now sees, having escaped the conventional expectations of how she is supposed to see according to those around her. As you can tell, I think it matters a lot that she's alone at this point. She has this moment only when she is alone and when she's escaped these expectations, these conventional considerations and solicitudes of those around her. After all, she is just now a widow, as far as they know. Well, what emerges from this is, again, one of these slightly different but not discordant themes. It's called the virtue of solitude emerges as a theme, as does the falsifying pressures of social expectation and convention. These two seem to fit together pretty well. I'm going to repeat that. The virtue of solitude here emerges as a theme, as does the falsifying pressures of social expectation and convention. And I would argue that these two, really the same theme, fit in real nice. They're not to be identified with this issue that we talked about, or this theme that we delineated on the last plate, right? Which is this theme of that you get by way of a plot-wise reading of the story. It's not a story about the intensity of emotion so much as it is a story about a disappointed freedom, right? And the necessity of freedom. That fits in very well with this business about solitude and the falsifying pressures of social expectation and convention, even though I think it's enough different that it should be distinguished as such. Another such, by the way, different if not discordant theme, and this is a student in another section, although some of you got into this issue on the quiz, and I think I could have quoted one of your quizzes to the same effect. Men and women oppress each other, even if it's out of love or kindness. This, of course, is the quiz item that had to do with the feelings of the husband, Mr. Mallard, for his wife, right? He seems to really love her, doesn't he? She finds that love oppressive, right? So we get this complex and interesting little theme of love. Men and women oppress each other, even if it's out of love or kindness. Love and freedom. This is how we can maybe put these themes together. Love and freedom can be at odds. Not always do we, when loving a thing, set it free. Okay, is the way to maybe state this theme more abstractly. And here's a yet further abstract statement of the theme. Chopin's story is a story about love as well as freedom, and about individuality as well as love. Okay, last plate. Virtuous Poe. Mullen writes, quote, subtlety of motivation is presumed to be a virtue of fiction. The more subtle the motive, the more virtuous the fiction. The worthier, richer, the better. Regarding mod3 Q2, you recall the questions. How virtuous is Poe's story according to the definition of virtuous fiction provided by Mullen? Does it imbue or endow its protagonist, Montresor, with a complex motive? That's what Mullen argues virtuous or worthy fictions do, or what many worthy literary critics think worthy virtuous fictions do. Or is Poe's killer not really all that different from Sparks' Lord Lucan, who's notable for his superficiality, his sociopathic lack of complex motivation, his textbook aspirations, in the words of a former student, or his lack of aspirations of any kind, what a Shakespeare critic calls motiveless malignancy? Well, having read through your responses to Mod 3Q2, my response is nice job on a tricky issue, because it really is a tricky issue. The question of the virtuous story, as Mullen might define it, I would argue is best approached by distinguishing between subtlety or complexity of motivation and subtlety in its presentation or narration, what Mullen calls subtlety of analysis. Now, this is something that Mullen doesn't lay out for us, as he might have, and as I frankly wish he had taken the trouble to do. That is, one may have, with respect to a character's motives in any story, one, analyze complexity. That's one of the four possible conditions when you factor, if you remember this from math, you factor the questions of complexity and the questions of analysis. Its presence or its absence in both cases. So here you have both analysis and complexity, right? Analyze complexity. His example, read through Mullen, is the work of Henry James. He talks about at some length, or at least for a few sentences in that one paragraph. A second condition, unanalyzed, okay, complexity. Depth of motive merely hinted at, clearly indicated, but left mysterious. And as we're going to find out, this is a really important little category. Number three, analyzed simplicity, or analyzed uncomplexity, no complexity, right? And you have the story in which you have a lot of analysis going on of motive, but every time the narrator begins to look into the depths of a particular person's motives and motivation and psychological makeup and all the rest, you get a sense that there's not a lot of depth there to be explored, right? In Sparks' novels is a good example of this. Why do people do evil? Just because they like to do evil. And you don't get any sense of anything interesting going on inside them, right? And number four, the fourth condition, unanalyzed, okay, lack of complexity. No complexity, no analysis. And I think that's what we have, isn't it? Typically when we have a fable or a folk tale or a joke, right? We never ask ourselves, what's the motive of the fox? He's a fox, in a fable. Okay, number one, right? No, you saw this coming. Analyze complexity. That would be the most virtuous. And the least virtuous of these four possibilities would have to be number four, unanalyzed simplicity. And I want to offer a caveat here, which is that the stories probably are in a range. They fall into the range of these various factors as opposed to fitting neatly into any one of these categories. Okay, so let's keep that in mind as we go forward. Well, turning to what you had to say, Nathan would give Poe's story a 4. A subtle motive is one that isn't clearly apparent, which makes for a more virtuous story. So it is hard to say that the cask is virtuous. The motive is clear from the very beginning. When Fortunato ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. Many of you quoted that opening line that seems to take care of the whole question of motivation right up front, right? It's far from subtle, his motivation, Nathan argues. There's no wonder. Nathan explained what he meant by that, and I thought did a very nice job of laying out this case very clearly for those who felt that this is not an example of virtuous fiction, according to Mullen's definition of virtue. Though Naya seems to disagree, right, on the surface. And quote, when she agrees that this story can be considered virtuous, she seems to be in disagreement with Nathan. However, she also points to this simple motive of revenge. So I wasn't sure exactly where Naya stood on this. Parker, on the other hand, appears to agree, but kind of does the other thing, right? Cites fresh evidence of virtuousness. Seems to agree that it's not virtuous, but then I believe cites good evidence of virtuousness by reference to those, quote, hints of jealousy coming from Montresor as the story unfolds. Montresor is not simply vengeful. This is Naya's point. He's also jealous, for example. He admires Fortunato as much as he hates him. And I'm sorry, I said Naya, I meant Parker. And Parker gives some good evidence in support of her case. Quote, although Poe gives us some motivation for ending Fortunato's life, he leaves the perfect amount of mystery to give the story its haunting effect. I would argue then that Parker wants to give this story a 2, right? If you go back to number 2, unanalyzed complexity, depth of motive merely hinted at, right? Because we intuit depth, I think Parker's saying, but its exact nature, what's in the depths. We know there are depths. We know that there's a depth of motive there because we get a little look at it. We see this little hint of jealousy. We get these hints of, we get the larger statement of clear motive, which has to do with vengeance, and we get the feeling that that doesn't exhaust it. There's all kinds of depth down there. It's nothing simple that is causing his working against Fortunato as he does, right? We get the sense of the mystery of his motivation, maybe the mystery of motivation in general. Jocelyn also seems to point to a 2, by the way. In virtuous fiction, quote, the motivation for why something occurs is questionable and causes the reader to ponder the reason behind the action. Interestingly, then, I would argue, both Parker and Jocelyn suggest that in earning a 2, Cask may just be more virtuous than if it earned a 1. In other words, do they not both call into question and reverse the 1-2 ranking above? Something Adriana also wonders about when she asks, do you think that the motivation needs to be completely hidden but its presence indicated, right? It can't be so hidden that you just don't think there's any depth. In order for a story to be considered more virtuous, as per Mullen's definition. If the answer is yes, then Bridget concurs. Quote, we do not know the exact reason why Montresor asks Fortunato. And that makes a story virtuous because it's the uncertainty of the motivation which makes it so alluring in a way. Once again, we have to intuit that there is a massive motive, powerful motive down below that's operating, right? We're just not sure what it is. And we just have little hints, to go back to what Parker was saying. We have little hints of certain motives that don't fit into what maybe the character is, especially when it's a first-person narrative, what the character's admitting to, right? We do not know the exact reason why Montresor acts against Fortunato, right? She says, and it's the uncertainty of the motivation which makes it so alluring in a way. Again, depth must be disclosed, but must not be plumbed. And that's what gets us this 2 rating. It's not plumbed, it's not analyzed, it's not specified, it's not explored in detail. And what I like is what you guys are doing implicitly, which is wondering whether that doesn't make it more virtuous, according to Mullen's readings, than Mullen himself would say when he's talking about Henry James and finds this thoroughly explored depth to be the most virtuous of all possible conditions of fiction and of motivation of fiction. Of Cask, Jocelyn notes in passing how, quote, there is evidently some kind of reasoning for Montresor's decision to kill Fortunato. We intuit that. but it's just unknown. We can't seem to get to the bottom of what he's all about. Adriana, summing up this position, notes that quote, the quieter, I thought that was nicely phrased, the quieter the motive, the more successful or virtuous the fiction is. To know all is to forgive all. She's quoting Mullen, who is himself referencing George Eliot, the novelist. To know all is to forgive all. Without the reader knowing anything about Montresor's motivation, or knowing very much beyond a few hints about Montresor's motivation, the reader is stripped of the chance to excuse the villain. The reader is then left to speculate the reasons behind the action. As quote, everyone has his or her own unspoken needs and reasons. Okay, all very good, all well said. I want to introduce a slightly different angle here, and one that's easy to overlook, okay? How important it is that we recognize Montresor's story as something told, as indeed a story of a plot against Fortunato, but also a story with a plot, where you could argue that Montresor's plotting against us, his listeners, as much as he is Fortunato. But he's plotting against us in the telling of the story, just as he plotted against Montresor in the events of the story. Montresor is obviously a plotter. Let's take one step back further. So is Poe. And I would argue that Poe's plot is not equal to Montresor's plot. Montresor plots against Fortunato. Perhaps Montresor plots against the reader, might even, in the telling of the story, as I said, as opposed to in the events of the story, might even plot against himself in the telling of the story. I would argue that Poe plots against Montresor. And let me try to explain what I'm talking about. Okay, Montresor's a real character, you may feel. You know, he's a character. He's a cool cat. He has style, that business with a trowel, for example, where he pulls it out from underneath the folds of his overcoat at a particular moment. And really looks like a cool guy, a chill dude. Stylistic chill, however, does not indicate emotional or psychological depth. And one can see why Nathan says what he does, going back to Nathan, who kicked off this entire item, right? Montresor is quite static, which I thought was well said. If he had truly felt insulted, wouldn't one feel some sort of emotion? Wouldn't he feel some sort of emotion when he finally gets his revenge at the very end of the story? Anything at all, be it happy, sad, regretful, anything, as opposed to just reporting it, which just makes it feel he killed just to kill with no motive at all, and he's like Lord Lucan. But reading plot-wise, hang on a moment, do we not stop and ask, doesn't he feel some sort of emotion there at the end? And maybe not one that he is himself ready to embrace. This is, as I say, he's plotting against himself. Poe's plotting against him by making him give himself away. Back up a bit further. Why is he telling this? Why is he telling us this story? Wait, who is he telling this story? That's an interesting detail. Remember, we have a direct address to an audience at one point. You who so well know the nature of my soul. Who is that? It's a really interesting kind of question, and it opens up this space that makes us wonder whether this isn't a rhetorical performance as much as anything else. It really gives us a sense of a plot in the telling as opposed to a plot in the doing, right? Why include certain details, which he does include, which Poe makes sure he includes, which are easily missed when we read for the story, for the what, by the way, let me mention in passing, how he answers for the love of God, right? After Fortunato says, for the love of God, Montresor, and Montresor answers for the love of God. That's a very intriguing moment, and then waits impatiently for a reply. Why? Why does he wait? What is he hoping to hear in that moment? Depth of motivation emerges as we read plot-wise. He's a more complex character. His relationship with Fortunato, his feelings for Fortunato, his feelings about Fortunato, his feelings about himself are much more complex than they appear to be. Character emerges, real character, as opposed to this, oh, he's a character. No, we mean character, depth of character, psychological complexity, complexity of feeling, complexity of thought and feeling. Montresor recalls, you will recall, at the very end, feeling sick at heart as he finishes the job and puts the last brick in place. But quickly adds, you will recall, is it feeling the need to control? Is it feeling the need to control his auditors and the readers, understanding? It was due to the dampness of the catacombs. Well, what was it really due to? Right? What really making him sick at heart at the very end? That ultimate formulation I leave to you, but I believe that however we formulate it, we're going to be leaning in the direction that I think a number of you were, in your discussion of the story, which is that it is virtuous according to the Mullen definition, and it is in fact somewhere there in the number 2, the range of number 2, right? In that range, as opposed to 1, 3, or 4. Okay, well, we could go on. We won't, because it's a long enough micro lecture as it is, turning into a macro lecture. And I will be in touch with you again soon. Keep your eyes open for, of course, your not quite midterm, but approaching midterm, certainly first third, first fourth of the term, preliminary grades. Okay, and be seeing you next week.